Hello, this is Jo from Strawberry Attic. Today I'm making the Cecily dress that came free with this month's Simply Sewing magazine. Usually I find the Sewgirl patterns really good for my size, however this one was going to come up a little bit small, so I needed to make some alterations before I started sewing. I worked out overall I needed to add 2 inches to the bust of the dress to make it fit a little bit more comfy. So this was going to be ½ inch per pattern piece. Because I didn't want to alter the neckline or make the shoulders wider, I decided to split that ½ inch into 2 sections across the pattern. One 3 inches from the centre front seam or centre front of the dress, and one a further 4 inches over meeting in the shoulder seam. So I split the pattern in these places, added a little strip of paper, measured ½ inch across on this new strip, and then sellotaped the pattern back together before proceeding with making the dress. The alteration to the pattern has slightly distorted the shoulder seam, so I've just redrawn that line in so it's nice and smooth, and then trim that off of the pattern piece. This process is repeated on the back of the pattern, so from the centre back seam I measure in 3 inches and then a further 2 inches. The pattern is then cut and I add a slip of paper in between these gaps, measure out ½ inch and then cut through. This process is repeated on the facing, but because the facing doesn't go as far as the shoulder, I only need to add that first ½ inch. So measuring out from the centre of the facing piece, front and back, I measure my 3 inches, draw a line, cut the pattern, add a little slip of paper at ½ inch wide, and then sellotape the pattern piece back together. Now time to start cutting out the fabric. This time of year I'm always going to choose Halloween fabric. I absolutely love Halloween. In fact, to be honest, I'll wear Halloween all year round. It's quite normal to see me strutting around in the spring covered in pumpkins. When using fabric with such a prominent design on it, it's really important when cutting out your pattern pieces to make sure that your fabric is always going to be the right way up. The skirt panel of the dress is cut on the fold, which is going to give a nice smooth long piece for the front of the dress. You really don't like having seams up the front of garments if I can help it. When I cut out the belt, I did add a little bit of extra length to it to make up for the extra 2 inches overall that I'd added to the pattern. Really, I wish I had added a little bit longer because this belt came up very, very short. And then I cut out the rest of the pieces from the fabric. It's not until editing that I've realised that actually I have done both my sleeves upside down. It's obviously not that noticeable because I didn't notice it when I tried the dress on, but silly mistakes. I was obviously having a tired day that day. I start by sewing up the centre seam of the back of the dress. Usually this would be left open because this is where the zip goes in. However, on this dress it has got a side zip, something that quite often trips me up, and it will come and bite me on the bum later with this dress. Next, it's time to sew up the darts. Starting with the edge of the fabric, I sew the sewing machine over to the narrowest point. I leave the strands nice and long and then tie a knot in them. You can go back a couple of stitches to lock the seam rather than knotting it, but that can add a little bit of bulk, especially if you're using finer fabrics. This cotton's not too bad, but it's good to get in good practices. Pinning together the fascia for the neck hole. It's always important when you are adding a fascia that's already joined to a garment that's already joined that you make sure you use the same seam allowance. Otherwise, when you come to put them together, you're going to end up with them not fitting properly. When I was sewing the darts, I did just sew over the seam edge of the sleeves and get a nice flat seam. I'm pinning it here. I probably didn't need to because the fabric's not likely to slip, but it's good practice to get into. Pinning up the sides of the belt, I'm going to leave a gap in the middle while I'm pinning here, so I'm going to just leave my pins facing a different way to remind me to leave that gap. That way, when I need to turn the belt the right way round, I can fit my hand in and make it really easy to get that turned. And then pinning together the shoulder seams, I do make sure I am sticking to that 1 centimetre seam allowance. You can see that some of the edges from when I cut it out have now been serged. I've only done this to the edges that are going to remain seen on the inside of the dress, just to keep it nice and clean and tidy. I've avoided doing that on the inside of the neck and the facing because that will just add bulk, and I want to get that as flat as possible once it's all sewn together and pressed. Usually when finishing off sleeves I would hand sew that down, but because this is black cotton on black, I'm just cheating and going through the sewing machine. This sewing project, I've only just added it in this month. I wasn't going to do it yet, but I had a little bit of space in with what I was going to share with you guys. Because I've got quite a lot of big projects happening in October, but I can't reveal any of those just yet because 2 of them are guest outfits for wedding guests, and the other one is a spooky Halloween treat. So despite me busy working on them, I haven't been able to share too much about them. So I just added this dress as a nice, quick and easy make for one weekend. There is a stupid thing to say, quick, easy and sewing don't always go together. There are some really silly mistakes I made on this dress. I was obviously having a fibro fog day. I thought I was doing all right, but there's a few moments with my sewing where you can see the cogs turning and nothing is coming to mind of why things are going wrong, but we'll get to that a bit later. Here, sewing up the edges of the zip. When I get to the corners, I'm going to drop the needle, lift the foot and then turn my fabric and then drop the foot again before sewing on. This gets a lovely crisp corner of the belt. And then when I go to turn that the right way round, I trim the corners, and again this will help with getting that nice crisp edge. Pulling the fabric through from the belt, I then usually I'd use at the end of a paintbrush, but today I've used a flat metal ruler. This will just get a nice crisp edge. What I find is if I run the ruler down the length of the seam, it helps turn it before pressing it, and it will stop me having to fiddle too much near the steam of the iron. This belt is finished with a good press. I just fold in where the hole in the fabric was for me to turn it and give that a good press before running a line of stitches round to finish that off. Joining the facing to the dress, starting off I've put a pin in either seam on the shoulders, and then I've matched up the markings on the dress for the centre front, and then I gently go round working it in the easing together those joins so it all fits nicely and it's going to lay flat when it's sewn together. If you start from one end and work it round rather than joining the two seams, you can end up with a little bit of excess fabric, so it's better to get that evenly distributed around the whole seam. Back on the sewing machine, I'm attaching the facing to the neck hole. I'm going to do this really nice and slowly. The last thing I want is any puckers coming through, so I'm using my hand just to feel through to make sure that's lying nice and flat as they join together. Also, it's really important to keep this a really even stitch around. You don't want your stitch sliding off more to one side and ending up with a wonky neck hole. Adding the skirt panel to the front of the dress here, I've already pressed in some box pleats. I did add the extra inch into both the front piece and the back piece of the skirt, so the box pleats have had to be altered slightly, but I've kept them nice and even to the front of the dress. And here's me very quickly just attaching the pockets to the side of the dress. This will come back and bite me on the bum later. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I completely forgot this dress had the side zip in, and as I say, I was having a bit of a foggy day and I just couldn't get the logistics of how that zip is going to go in and keep the pocket accessible. You'll see me later having a head scratching moment while I try and figure it out. Clipping the inside of the facing where it's attached to the neck is going to help when it presses to get a nice smooth finish. And with it all pressed, what I'm doing is I'm just running a line of stitches in the ditch, tacking down the inside of the facing to the shoulder, and that way when you put the dress on, the facing isn't going to ruck up and be left hanging out. It's a really good trick, just running a line of stitches on both the shoulder seams and also that centre back seam. I repeat this process. I then, once pressed, take this to the sewing machine and run a line of stitches around the just where the about 1/4 inch away from the stitch line on the facing, holding down the seam allowance. This will stop the facing from rucking up while wearing it and sticking it out, and gives a lovely crisp clean finish. This method is known as understitching. Busy sewing away, getting on really well, and little did I know my bobbins run out. I failed today at bobbin roulette. When marking up the pattern, I used a friction pen. These are absolutely great because when you iron over the fabric, the friction pen just vanishes with the heat. Where I've pressed my sleeves, all these markings have disappeared, so I'm just using the pattern piece and reapplying any markings that I need to be able to line the sleeves up on the dress. Usually when adding sleeves to a dress, you would make the sleeve complete, and then, similar to how I did with the facing piece, you would pin the prominent points all the way around the sleeve and then ease the remaining of the sleeve into the arm's eye. Because it is all the side seams in the dress haven't been finished, I'm actually doing a little cheat here. I'm fitting the sleeves while the garment is flat. And then what I'll do is, when I sew the side seams up, I will also include that little 2 inches of sleeve seam as well. It's not the best practice, but it's just easier. My brain was lacking this day. Using plenty of pins to go around the edge. The last thing you want when sewing the sleeve on is any little puckers, so I'm being really careful with my pinning to get a nice crisp finish when it's done. Sewing the sleeves in place, I take this really slowly. Again, I'm using a centimetre seam allowance and just using my hand to feel through the fabric to make sure there aren't any little puckers, to guide that round. Usually when adding any curve into a garment, you'd finish by clipping it before you turn it. Because this is going to be a seam that's seen, get that right. So yeah, a seam that's seen, I have already serged it. Goodness, this is turning into a tongue twister. So the finished seam is being serged as opposed to being clipped. That's the one. I'm just going to make sure when I press the sleeve seam that I use a little bit of steam to manipulate and get that sitting nice and flat. Are you ready for the head scratching bit? Here I am trying to fit the side zip I knew something wasn't right. My brain was telling me to stop, and I just couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong. You do see that I have a light bulb moment of realising that it's all gone wrong, so I unpick that pocket seam where I've already attached it to the skirt. I think this has solved the problem, but little did I know I've still got a whole lot of messing up coming up along the way. Yeah, anyway, not my finest hour, but hey ho. Here's me thinking that I've sorted the problem and pinning it all back together. It's still wrong. So what should have happened with this seam is I should have attached the pocket direct to the zipper, and then put that back onto the other pocket and sewn that side down first, leaving the opening of the pocket and travelling around the edge of the pocket with my stitching. But I don't do that. I really don't like side zips, especially when you've got pockets, and every dress should have pockets, because without pockets, what are we? Where are we going to hide all the fun things in life, like sweeties and chocolate? And I do like a pocket, but they are the bane of my existence sometimes. So starting with the side seam that doesn't have the zip in it, I sew a couple of inches on the sleeve and then drop the needle, lift the foot and turn the fabric to get a nice crisp corner, and then carrying on down the skirt I get to the pocket, travel my stitching round the edge of the pocket because that's going to leave the opening, so I can still access and use that pocket. Travel my stitching round that 1 centimetre seam allowance, get back to the skirt, again lift and turn the fabric, and then carry on down to the bottoms of the seam. Makes a change as well in this one. I'm actually trimming my threads as I go. I'm an absolute devil for leaving that till the very end, and usually the first time I wear a dress out I find at least 4 or 5 trims of thread that I have forgotten to cut off. And they spend the whole time tickling me like a little spider is on me. And whilst I do love Halloween, me and spiders are not friends. So time to sew up the side seam with the zip in. Trundling along on the machine, I get the sleeve done first and then come up to the top of the zip. In my head I'm still telling myself something's wrong, but I'm just not actioning it. I wish I had spent a little bit more time trying to figure out what was going on, but my little fibro frog head would not have any of it. So while I'm busy away sewing here, I'm hoping you're liking sharing this video with me. If you are enjoying it, do please give the video a like, and if you're really enjoying it, do click that subscribe button. I've got lots of projects coming up, especially Halloweeny ones in the pipeline that I'm really looking forward to sharing once I've worn the dress to the event. But do click to subscribe to my channel and you'll get to enjoy more of my sewing antics. really helps me if I get comments on my videos, and also those likes and subscribes. It helps my channel become more noticeable for other people that might be interested in my little sewing projects. The best thing about sewing is that once you've made a garment once, you can figure out if there are any alterations that need to be made. If it's quite an expensive fabric, I do recommend that you make a mock-up first to iron out all these little things that could go wrong. But I haven't done this because, as I said earlier, I thought this was going to be a nice simple make. Little did I know my brain was not playing ball that day. So the easiest thing to do is make amendments to the pattern as a reminder for next time. And to ensure that I will never go wrong on this dress with that pesky side zip interfering with my love of pockets, I decide to make a drastic choice. Now I've figured out what I did wrong, it would be easy to make the dress again. But right there in that moment, there was so much frustration. I was tired, I'd had enough, and I just wanted to sit on the sofa. So choices were made, patterns were altered, and I'll sleep easier at night if I'm quite honest. I'm quite glad with the choice I have made. I won't lose any sleep. Problem solved. And also make sure here that I am altering the facing piece. I've just added a centimetre of seam allowance, so next time I cut it out I don't leave myself short. But this means that I can now move the zip from the side seam. I'm going to have it running down the back. It's not going to interfere with my pockets, and life will be easier. To finish the dress off, I am using my ruler and just measuring round 2 centimetres at the bottom of the dress. You probably notice here that I'm swapping between centimetres and inches all the time. Here in the UK we don't know what we're doing with the imperial stuff, so they keep filtering over into my conversation. Well done Brexit. So anyway, yeah, I'm just measuring up a 2 centimetre seam allowance and going around with pins. I take the dress over to the ironing board once I've done, and I'm going to press that 2 centimetres all the way round, and then fold the skirt over another time, getting all those raw edges seamed in and hidden away. And then I finish the skirt off. I am using a hand stitch for this. I use a slip stitch to finish the hem of the dress off. Had the hem been a little bit narrower, I would have probably used the sewing machine, but by the time you get 2 inches up the skirt with a seam or a run of stitching, it can be more noticeable on the dress. So I'm going to finish this off by hand. And that's the dress finished. Here I am standing in the garden modelling it. I absolutely love how this has turned up. I think making it again, I probably am going to alter the neckline a little bit. But modelling it here, I've got my irregular choice Hubble Bubble boots on, and also a pair of the Jack-o'-lantern snag tights.
You only put one pocket in.
And to finish off my little weekend of sewing, a nice big glass of wine to enjoy with my dinner, a little birthday treat. My husband cooked my dinner this weekend, so I could just sit and relax. Thanks for joining me.